Maria stood at the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over the receipt to the customer. "You can't afford it," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. Her heart sank, but before she could respond, she noticed the look on his face. He was satisfied. What he didn't know was that her husband, the undercover boss, had just heard every word. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Maria had been working at the corner convenience store for nearly 5 years now. It was a small place, tucked between a dry cleaner and a hair salon. Its windows always fogged up from the summer heat. People from the neighborhood passed by, some of them regulars, others just stopping in for a soda or a pack of gum. But to Maria, it had always been just a job, a way to make ends meet after coming to America with her dreams in a suitcase. She never thought of herself as anyone special. She was just another face in the crowd, a quiet woman who had learned to blend in, to take up as little space as possible. She didn't mind the work. In fact, she'd gotten used to the rhythm of it, the beep of the scanner, the crinkle of paper bags, the hum of the fluorescent lights above. But there were days when the exhaustion from pretending, from being invisible, weighed heavily on her. Today was no different, or so she thought. It started as a normal Tuesday morning, a slow drizzle tapping lightly on the window, a few customers filtering in and out. But then, as Maria was restocking the shelves near the front, a man entered. He was tall, with an air of arrogance about him, wearing a suit that seemed a little too tight for his frame. He approached the counter with a cold stare, his shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. "Excuse me," he said sharply, catching her attention. "Can you hurry up? I don't have all day." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a sharpness that cut through the stillness of the shop. Maria glanced up, offering a polite smile. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll be right with you." She finished placing the item on the shelf and made her way to the register. He continued, his voice rising slightly. "Are you even paying attention? You're supposed to be working here, not just standing around." His words stung, but Maria kept her head down, focusing on the task at hand. "I'm sorry, sir," she repeated, trying to stay calm. The man's tone grew even more caustic. "It's people like you who make everything take forever. You don't even know how to do your job right. Do you?" he sneered, throwing his change on the counter. Maria froze. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the coins. She could feel the other customers in the store glancing over, their eyes darting away quickly as if they too were too uncomfortable to watch. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. No one spoke up, no one said anything. She didn't know why she was so upset. It wasn't like she hadn't faced worse in the past: racism, ignorance, the quiet dismissal of her presence. But something about this moment, about the way the man spoke to her so condescendingly, pierced through her. It felt like it wasn't just about the words. It felt like the world had reduced her to a mere inconvenience. She shifted uncomfortably as she handed him his change. But just as he grabbed the bills, disaster struck. Her hand brushed against the edge of the counter, and in a split second, a small glass teapot tipped over, sending a stream of hot tea spilling across the surface. The liquid splashed onto the counter, the hot steam rising into the air. She gasped, startled by the suddenness of it. But it wasn't the tea that made her heart race. It was the way the man's eyes narrowed, the way he took a step back as if she had done something unspeakable. "Unbelievable," he muttered, wiping his hands on his pants as if the spill was a personal insult to him. "Can't even keep things in order for 5 minutes." Maria's face burned. She bent down quickly to wipe up the mess, the tears welling up behind her eyes. But she swallowed them back. She couldn't let him see. She wouldn't. And then, as she bent over, something caught her eye, a shard of glass from the teapot. Catching the light, it lay there on the floor, reflecting the overhead lights, and for a moment, it felt like it was reflecting her own brokenness. The image of the glass on the floor, fragile and shattered, mirrored the pieces of herself that had cracked over the years. The silent humiliation, the invisible weight of being less than, of always having to shrink to fit the world's expectations. But no one spoke up. No one intervened. As she stood up, she saw the man walking out of the store, his shoulders stiff, his expression unchanged. No apology, no acknowledgement of the mistake he'd made. He just left, as if he'd dropped a coin into a slot machine and had gotten exactly what he wanted. Maria watched him go, her hands still trembling as she wiped down the counter. The silence in the store felt heavy, almost suffocating. She thought for a moment that maybe, just maybe, the moment would pass, that she could go back to doing her job and forget about the way he made her feel. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. It wasn't just the spilled tea. It was something inside of her. Something that told her this couldn't go on forever. She had lived in the shadows for too long. Maybe it was time to stop letting people walk all over her. Maybe it was time to stand up. But how, and at what cost? She didn't know yet, but as the last of the customers filed out and the door chimed behind them, she wiped the counter once more, her thoughts swirling, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the choice she made next would change everything. Maria stepped through the door of her small apartment, the sound of the door closing behind her a hollow echo in the quiet hallway. The familiar scent of pasta sauce simmering in the kitchen did little to comfort her. It was just another evening. The same routine that had been running on autopilot for months, maybe even years. She kicked off her shoes, her feet sore from standing all day. But it wasn't the physical exhaustion that weighed on her tonight. It was the words. The man's voice still lingered in her mind like an echo. The condescension, the way he made her feel invisible, unimportant. How could something so simple, just a few words, cut so deep? She wasn't sure what hurt more. The humiliation of being belittled in front of a room full of strangers, or the crushing realization that no one had stood up for her. Her son, Lucas, was sitting at the kitchen table, quietly drawing. At 10 years old, he already seemed far too mature for his age, his small hands moving swiftly as he shaded in a picture of a house. He never asked her about her day, and she never volunteered the details. He could sense her moods, and tonight, he could tell something was off. But he didn't ask, he just kept drawing, as if his art could fill the silence between them. She tried to shake the image of the man's face from her mind as she hung up her coat and set down her bag. The apartment was small, cramped even, with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights that never seemed to quite work properly. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. She had learned to live with the imperfections, to accept them as part of the life she'd built for herself and her son. Maria walked into the kitchen, opening the refrigerator to pull out a jar of leftovers. The rhythmic sound of the microwave starting up felt almost meditative, but the comfort it provided was fleeting. The more she tried to push the thoughts away, the more they gnawed at her, clawing at the edges of her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about the way the customers had looked at her, the way they had silently sided with the man who had insulted her. Lucas pushed his drawing aside and looked up at her, his brown eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you okay, Mom?" She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, baby, just a little tired." He nodded, but he didn't believe her. He never did. It hurt her, more than anything, to know that Lucas was growing up with a mother who wore her pain like a cloak. Never speaking about it but never truly hiding it either. Maria tried to shake the thoughts from her head as she began setting the table, moving with practiced efficiency, but everything felt heavier now. The man's words were still ringing in her ears, louder than the clink of plates and silverware. She glanced at Lucas, his pencil now tapping nervously on the edge of the table. She could feel his concern, his awareness of her unrest. Her husband, Jorge, was working the night shift at the factory again, which meant he wouldn't be home until late. She had grown accustomed to the silence of the evenings spent alone with her thoughts. It was a quiet that spoke louder than any words ever could. She sat down at the table, picking up her fork and pretending to eat, but the food felt like sawdust in her mouth. She couldn't focus on the meal, couldn't concentrate on the mundane task of feeding herself. Her mind kept drifting back to the store, to the man's voice, to the way he made her feel so small, so insignificant. "Why don't you stand up to them, Mom?" Lucas asked suddenly, his voice small but filled with something like hope. He was still tapping his pencil, his face serious for such a young boy. Maria paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She hadn't expected him to say that. How could she explain to him the layers of fear, the years of silently taking whatever was thrown her way, without making him lose hope in the world? How could she tell him that sometimes standing up didn't always mean you'd win? I don't know, honey, she said softly, placing the fork down. Sometimes it's easier to just keep quiet. But it's not fair, Lucas insisted, looking at her as if she were the one who could make it better. People shouldn't treat you like that. Her heart ached. How could she explain to him that life wasn't always fair? How could she tell him that it wasn't just the man in the store, but a world full of people who looked past her, who saw her as invisible, as nothing more than a face in the crowd? She had been told her whole life that she was less than the people who walked past her on the street. Less than the people who worked their way up the ladder. Less than the people who had everything she didn't. It was all a part of the silent system she was stuck in. One she hadn't known how to fight against. The thought of standing up, of confronting the injustice head on, seemed almost impossible. What good would it do? Who would listen to her? What could one woman, one voice, possibly change? But as she looked at Lucas, sitting there with all the confidence of youth, she felt a spark deep inside her, a small flicker that had been buried for too long. It was as if his innocent belief in what was right could ignite something in her. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. She let out a slow breath, the tension in her chest tightening again. I know it's not fair, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. But sometimes, it's the way the world works. Lucas didn't respond. He just picked up his drawing again and continued with the house, his small hands working steadily. Maria watched him, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of his quiet optimism. She knew he didn't understand everything. He was still so young, so full of hope, but maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe it wasn't too late for her. Maybe it wasn't too late to fight back. But as the evening wore on, a heavy sense of doubt crept back in. The weight of it all felt unbearable. How could she stand up when everything inside her screamed for silence? She didn't know. But one thing was clear. If she kept going on like this, she would never find peace. One day, the quiet would swallow her whole. And she couldn't let that happen. She stood up from the table, her hands trembling slightly, the uneaten food forgotten. I'll do better tomorrow, she said, though it wasn't for him, it was for herself. I'll try to be braver. But deep inside, Maria knew that the silence had gone on long enough. One day, she would have to speak up. The next day at the store, Maria couldn't shake the weight of the previous afternoon. The man's words replayed in her mind like a broken record, each time sharper than before. She had tried to leave it behind as she stepped into work that morning. But it followed her, settled deep in her chest, reminding her that she had been humiliated, not just by a stranger, but by a system that didn't see her, didn't care to. She shuffled through the morning's usual bustle, restocking shelves, sweeping the floor, smiling at customers, doing everything she could to blend in, to escape the spotlight. But it wasn't working. The smile she gave was forced. Her hands moved mechanically. She tried to focus on the rhythm of her work, the beep of the register, the shuffle of feet across the tile. But every sound felt too loud, too piercing. It was as if the entire world was just waiting for her to break. And then, like a cruel twist of fate, her manager walked in. Raymond. He was tall, in his mid-40s, with slicked back hair and the kind of sharp suit that screamed, I am in control. He hadn't been around much the day before, but now he stood in front of the counter, arms crossed, looking at her with a disapproving frown. He had heard about what had happened with the customer yesterday, and Maria could feel the coldness of his gaze even before he spoke. Maria, he said, his voice flat, his eyes narrowing as he glanced over the store. I've been hearing a lot of complaints about you lately. She froze, her stomach twisting into a knot. Complaints? What could she have done wrong? She hadn't done anything differently. But then, she realized, it wasn't about what she did. It was about who she was. She was the easy target, the one who was invisible enough to be blamed. You're taking longer to finish tasks. The store's falling behind because of you. He continued, his voice sharp. I need you to speed up, or I'll have no choice but to reconsider your position here. Maria's heart pounded. She hadn't been slacking. She hadn't been lazy. She was doing her best to keep everything running smoothly. But no one ever noticed that. No one ever saw the quiet sacrifices she made. No one except herself. But in his eyes, She was just another employee who didn't measure up. Another person to push around. Raymond didn't pause for her to respond. He turned away, muttering to himself about deadlines and numbers, and walked off as if nothing had happened, as if his words weren't enough to leave a mark. Maria stood there, frozen in place, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. The silence in the store was deafening. The few customers milling about kept their distance, as if nothing had happened. It was just another normal day in the world where people like her were always at the bottom. A few moments later, a familiar face appeared in line. It was Mr. Davidson, an older man who had been a regular for years. He always wore a navy blue cap and had a kind, weathered smile. She had served him countless times over the years, and he'd always been pleasant. Today, however, his face seemed different. There was an unreadable look in his eyes as he approached the counter. His usual cheer replaced by something else. "Maria," he said softly, but with a hint of hesitation. "How's everything going today?" She gave a small, strained smile, trying to push past the tension. "Same as usual," she said, her voice shaky. "How can I help you?" He nodded, but there was something in his expression that made her pause. He looked over at Raymond, who was still standing near the back of the store, barking orders at another employee, and then back at her. It wasn't much, but in that brief moment, Maria saw something she hadn't seen before: sympathy. He wasn't one of the many who had turned a blind eye to her suffering. He had noticed, he knew, but as quickly as that thought appeared, it faded. Mr. Davidson didn't say anything more. He placed his items on the counter, paying quickly and heading toward the door. She felt the weight of his silence as he left, a silent acknowledgement that was never spoken aloud. It was as if he knew, but chose to stay quiet, to leave her with the burden of dealing with it alone. Maria's chest tightened, and she felt a pang of loneliness like a sharp, cold knife twisting in her gut. The silence around her was deafening, and she felt the weight of the invisible walls that had always surrounded her. There was no one here to fight for her, no one who would speak up when she needed it most. She realized, with a sickening clarity, that in this place, she was nothing more than a faceless worker, a cog in a machine no one cared to stop. The thought of leaving crossed her mind, but she knew better than to dream of such things. What would she do? Where would she go? She had bills to pay, a son to care for. She couldn't afford to make waves. But as the hours dragged on, something inside her began to shift. It was the smallest thing, a whisper really, but it was there, growing louder. A need to stop accepting this treatment, this indifference. She had been invisible for too long. It was time for something to change. That afternoon, as the store began to quiet down and the last few customers trickled out, Maria found herself standing by the register, staring at the door. The weight of Raymond's words, the coldness of the store, and the emptiness she felt inside seemed to press on her chest, suffocating her. She had always tried to do the right thing, keep her head down, work hard, take care of her family. But it was never enough. No matter how much she gave, there was always someone like Raymond who would see her as less than, someone to control and diminish. She wiped her hands on her apron, staring out the window at the gray sky, wondering if she had the courage to change it all. Her heart ached with the knowledge that something had to give. She couldn't keep going like this. But even as the thought crossed her mind, a wave of doubt washed over her. What if standing up only made things worse? What if, in the end, it cost her everything? But the question that stayed with her, the one that refused to be ignored, was, what if I don't stand up? Maria had always been a creature of habit. Each morning, she awoke to the sound of the city stirring, cars honking, the distant hum of buses making their rounds, the soft chatter of neighbors on their way to work. She'd follow her quiet routine, brushing her hair into a neat ponytail, fixing a cup of coffee strong enough to carry her through the day, and walking to the convenience store where she worked. But something about today felt different. There was a change in the air, something subtle, like the shifting of a shadow just beyond her line of sight. She couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but it felt like the world was about to tip, just slightly, in a way that would never be the same again. The morning passed without incident. The usual stream of customers coming in and out. Maria did her job, kept her head down, smiled at the regulars who greeted her like an old friend. She worked, But her mind was far from the tasks at hand. She kept replaying Raymond's words from yesterday, his cold authority weighing on her shoulders. She was still angry, and more than that, she was tired. As the store quieted down after the lunchtime rush, Maria began restocking the shelves near the back. It was then that she overheard something that made her freeze. "I swear, he's just trying to squeeze us dry," a voice whispered from the aisle across from her. Maria turned slightly, careful not to let her presence be known. It was Shannon, one of the newer employees, speaking to Vince, another worker in the store. Shannon wasn't someone Maria usually talked to. She kept to herself, always quick to hide behind her phone or a book during breaks. But today, Shannon's voice carried a note of frustration that was hard to ignore. "Did you hear?" Shannon continued, her tone lower now. "Raymond's cutting our hours again. Said it's to improve efficiency. But I saw the payroll sheet. He's doing it to avoid paying overtime. He'll screw us out of our pay. And he doesn't even care." Maria's heart began to race. This was the kind of thing she had heard whispers of, but never confirmed. It was the kind of thing she suspected, but didn't dare believe. Yet here it was, someone else confirming it. Someone who worked alongside Raymond. Someone who knew the truth. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the weight of Shannon's words like a hammer hitting a nail into her chest. She wasn't imagining it. Raymond, the man who had been making her life miserable, was playing dirty, using his power to line his pockets while taking from everyone else. And now, the proof was right there, in the conversation she'd overheard. But just as quickly as the thought entered her mind, doubt crept in. What if Shannon was wrong? What if this was just a rumor? Something someone made up to stir up trouble? Maria had learned long ago not to jump to conclusions, especially when it came to people like Raymond, who could twist the truth to his advantage. Still, the possibility lingered, gnawing at her. What if it was true? What if the whole system was rigged against them? Against her? She didn't know what to do with the information. She couldn't just confront Raymond. She knew how that would go. She had no power, no leverage. She was just an employee. Someone easy to overlook. Someone easily disposable. The thought of standing up to him, of risking everything, filled her with both fear and a strange sense of purpose. It was then that Shannon's voice broke through her thoughts once again. "I'm serious, Vince. We need to do something about this. People are getting screwed, and no one is saying a word. You know what he's like. If we don't say something now, he's going to keep doing this. It's just gonna get worse." Maria stood there, the weight of Shannon's words pressing down on her chest like a vice. She wanted to speak up, to ask for more details, to confirm everything, but fear held her in place. What if she was overstepping? What if she was too late to stop it? What could she possibly do on her own? Shannon and Vince moved on, continuing their conversation, oblivious to Maria's presence. Maria felt a cold sweat trickle down her spine as she walked quietly back to the counter. The conversation echoed in her mind. She had learned so much in just a few minutes. But now she was left with an even bigger question. What should she do with this information? She glanced around the store, and the faces of her coworkers blurred into the background. How many of them were suffering like she was, but too afraid to speak up? How many of them were scared to lose their jobs? To lose the only thing that kept them going? Maria paused, her fingers resting lightly on the counter. As she tried to steady her racing thoughts, she knew the risks. She knew what it would cost her, her job, her peace of mind, maybe even her dignity. But she also knew that silence had cost her far too much already. Every day that she kept quiet, every day she let this go on, was a day she felt less and less like herself. Her mind raced. What if she collected more evidence? What if she spoke to others? Found out who else had seen what was really happening? What if she took a stand? The fear gnawed at her. She wasn't someone who was supposed to make waves. She wasn't someone who could fight back against the system. But as she thought about it, something shifted. She couldn't keep being the person who just took it. She couldn't live in this small, invisible world where people like her were always on the bottom. Always the ones who suffered in silence. Maria felt a flicker of hope deep inside her. But it was a fragile thing. She wasn't sure if she was ready to act on it. She wasn't sure if she could. But one thing was clear. Something had changed. She stood there for a long time, staring at the counter, her fingers still resting on the edge, the weight of the decision before her pressed down on her. And for the first time in years, Maria didn't feel quite so small. One simple text had opened a door she never thought she'd walk through. But would she walk through it? The morning after the unsettling discovery, Maria walked into work with a heavy heart. The whispers of betrayal, the evidence of Raymond's manipulation, and the knot in her stomach, all of it swirled in her mind like a storm that wouldn't pass. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something, but the view was too hazy to see the way forward. Every step felt like it could be the one that led to disaster. She moved through her usual morning routine, trying to keep her composure, but the uncertainty lingered. She had made the decision to look into Raymond's actions further, to dig deeper and gather proof. But the weight of it all was suffocating. What if she was wrong? What if this was all just a mistake, a misunderstanding? Could she handle the fallout? She wasn't sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. It wasn't until the afternoon, just after the lunch rush, that everything changed. The phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but Maria answered it anyway, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up the receiver. Maria? The voice on the other end was deep, calm, but there was an edge to it that Maria immediately recognized. It's David, a customer of yours. I'm sure you remember me. She did. David Miller. He was a regular at the store, an older man with gray hair and a kind demeanor. He was someone Maria had always gone the extra mile for, offering him friendly conversation and helping him with his groceries whenever he seemed a little too worn out to carry them himself. He had always been one of the few customers who saw her. Really saw her. I remember you, David. How are you? She asked, trying to mask the anxiety creeping into her voice. I'm doing well, thank you, he replied, but I'm calling because I've been following what's been happening, and I think it's time someone spoke up. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She leaned forward, her pulse quickening. What do you mean? David's voice lowered, his tone serious. I've been in this town a long time. Maria, I've seen things. People being treated unfairly. Things being swept under the rug. And I've noticed how Raymond's been running things. The way he's treated you. I've seen it, too. Maria swallowed hard, the realization sinking in like a stone. She had never imagined that someone, especially a regular customer, would be aware of the injustice she was facing. Her voice trembled as she spoke. You've noticed? David's sigh was heavy, filled with years of knowing too much and saying too little. More than just noticed. I've seen him pull those same stunts with others, cutting hours, threatening employees, using his position to exploit people who have no other choice but to stay silent. But you've been taking the brunt of it, and it's not right. Maria's chest tightened. She hadn't realized how badly the weight of her silence had been eating away at her until now. To hear someone else acknowledge it, to see that someone understood the pain she'd been carrying, felt like both a relief and a burden. David continued, his voice firm now. I've gathered some evidence. Maria, I've been keeping track of what's been going on behind closed doors. I have something that can help you, something concrete that proves Raymond is using his position for his own gain. It's time you had the upper hand. Maria felt the world shift beneath her feet. She had spent so much time trying to hide, trying to blend into the background, that the idea of taking action, of standing up for herself, had seemed like an impossible dream. But here was the proof she had been hoping for, the chance to finally fight back. I don't know what to say, she murmured, a rush of emotions flooding over her. Why are you helping me? David's reply was soft, but it carried weight, because someone needs to stand up, and maybe that someone is you. You've been quiet for too long. Maria, but you don't have to do this alone anymore. Her mind raced, her thoughts tangling together, the fear, the doubt, the shame, it all swirled together, threatening to pull her under. But in the back of her mind, a spark began to form. It was small, fragile, but it was there, hope, the possibility that things could change, that she could change. Maria took a deep breath, steadying herself. What do I need to do? David gave her the details, explaining where she could find the evidence and how to proceed without putting herself at risk. As the conversation ended, Maria felt a strange mix of emotions. She was afraid, yes, but she was also filled with something else, a sense of power, of agency, that she hadn't known she had. She put down the phone, her hands trembling. She had the evidence now. She had the truth in her hands. And she couldn't go back. The rest of the day dragged on. The customers continued to come and go. The clock ticked on, and Maria moved through her tasks like a ghost. But she couldn't stop thinking about what David had told her. The idea of standing up to Raymond, of confronting him with the truth, felt both terrifying and liberating. But as the evening wore on, a strange feeling settled over her. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this fight. Maybe there were people out there who saw what was happening, who were willing to stand by her when she couldn't stand alone. Maria glanced around the store, her mind still spinning. What would she do with this newfound knowledge? Would she risk it all for the chance at something better? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing. The silence had gone on long enough. She wasn't just going to stand by and let it happen anymore. The question now was, what would she do next? Maria stood outside the office door, her heart pounding in her chest. The files in her hand felt like they weighed a ton, each page a reminder of the years of frustration, the quiet suffering she had endured. Today was the day she was going to stand up, the day she would no longer remain invisible. The morning had felt like a blur, endless minutes stretching into hours as she waited for the moment when everything would either crumble or shift. She could hear the buzz of the store behind her, the hum of customers coming and going, the clink of cash registers. But it all felt distant, muffled, as if she were standing outside her own life. She couldn't shake the feeling that the storm she'd been waiting for had finally arrived. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the cool, sterile air of the office greeting her. Raymond was sitting at his desk, the same confident, disarming smile plastered on his face as he looked up at her. "Maria," he said with an exaggerated calmness, his voice the kind of smooth that suggested he thought he had the upper hand. "What's this about?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the center of the room and placed the stack of papers down on his desk. The sound of the files hitting the polished surface was sharper than she expected, louder. Almost too loud in the quiet office. "I've been keeping track of the changes around here," she began, her voice steady but laced with something else, something she hadn't expected. It was a feeling she'd never allowed herself to acknowledge before. Power. Raymond raised an eyebrow, but didn't speak, and for the first time, Maria didn't need him to. She was done waiting. She was done being silenced. "I know what you've been doing," she continued, her words slowly gathering strength. "Cutting hours, manipulating the payroll, threatening people, and I have proof." His eyes darkened slightly, but his smile didn't falter. "You're overreacting. Everything we do here is in line with company policy. Maria, you know that." Maria felt the familiar weight of doubt creeping in, but she pushed it aside. She'd come this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. "I've spoken to the others. I've seen the numbers, and I've seen how you treat your employees like they're disposable. This isn't just company policy, Raymond, it's personal." For a brief moment, she saw it, the mask slipping. His expression flickered, just for a second, before he quickly regained his composure. But Maria noticed. She always noticed. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," he said, leaning back in his chair with a calm that didn't match the underlying tension in the room. "We're just following the rules. You know the company's financial situation. If people can't handle the workload, they'll need to step aside. That's how it works." It was then that she realized something that chilled her to the core. Raymond wasn't just manipulating the rules, he believed in them. He believed that his actions were justified, that the system was working just as it should, and that made him dangerous. Not because he was some cruel villain, but because he was blind to the harm he was causing. He had wrapped himself in the security of the rules, convinced that they excused everything. Her hands clenched into fists. But she didn't back down. "You're not just breaking the rules," she said, her voice firm now. "You're breaking people. You're destroying lives. And I can't stay quiet about it anymore." Raymond's eyes narrowed, and the air between them thickened. He leaned forward, his posture shifting from one of casual authority to something more imposing. "Do you think anyone will believe you, Maria?" he asked, his voice low. "You're just one employee, one voice. What makes you think anyone's going to listen to you?" Maria felt a knot form in her stomach. But this time, she didn't flinch, because the truth doesn't need everyone to believe it. It only needs one person to stand up. And that's me." The words were out before she could stop them. And they felt different. They felt like a challenge. An invitation for him to do his worst. She wasn't going to back down. She had the evidence now. She had the truth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room felt like it had been stretching for hours. The tension thick and suffocating. Maria felt the weight of it in her chest. Her breath shallow. But she held her ground. Raymond's gaze didn't waver. And for a long time, he said nothing. He just watched her, calculating. Perhaps. But she didn't look away. She couldn't. This was her moment. The truth had been laid bare. And now there was no going back. Then, just as quickly, Raymond's demeanor shifted. He stood up and walked around his desk, his eyes never leaving hers. He moved closer, but Maria stood her ground, refusing to retreat. "This is a mistake, Maria," he said softly, his tone now almost sympathetic. "You've been working here for a long time. You know how things work. Do you really want to throw that all away?" Maria's heart raced, but she remained calm. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm trying to hold on to something, my dignity, my integrity." Raymond stopped in front of her, his hand resting on the edge of the desk. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "You're not going to win this fight. People like you never do. But I'll let you try. I'm not worried." Maria felt her pulse quicken. The words stung, but they also filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, and made to feel invisible. As she turned to leave, she knew this moment was only the beginning. Raymond might have the power, but she had something he could never take from her: the truth. And truth, Maria knew, was more powerful than anything. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway. But inside, Maria felt a new fire stir in her chest. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Maria stood at the edge of the store's back room, her hands resting on the cool metal of the counter, staring down at her phone. She had never been one to check her social media frequently. But today, something felt different. Something was shifting in the air. And she couldn't ignore it any longer. The video had gone viral. It had started quietly, a small flicker of a moment captured by a young employee who'd been working the counter during the altercation between Maria and Raymond. A simple tap of a phone screen. A few seconds of recorded footage, but those few seconds had been enough. They showed Maria standing tall, confronting Raymond, the quiet yet palpable tension in the air. They showed his dismissive gestures, the way he had leaned over her with an air of superiority. And most damning of all, the moment he had tried to shift the blame onto her for the company's mistakes. Maria had watched the video in disbelief when it first appeared on her phone screen. It felt surreal, seeing herself in that moment, captured in a way that no one had ever bothered to notice. But the reactions from her friends, her family, and even strangers, it was overwhelming. Comments flooded in, people expressing their shock, their anger, and, for the first time in her life, Maria felt seen. The video was everywhere. It spread like wildfire across social media, shared by local news outlets, discussed by friends and family. People started to speak up. Some had been witnesses to Raymond's mistreatment of Maria. Others had been unaware of what had been happening. But the truth was undeniable now. Maria wasn't just fighting her own battle anymore. She was fighting for all the people who had been mistreated, ignored, and silenced in the same way. Raymond, of course, hadn't expected any of this. When the video reached the company's corporate office, his smug confidence began to crack. His colleagues were no longer looking at him with the same respectful nods. They looked at him with suspicion. And then with disappointment. His influence began to wane. And Maria felt an odd sense of vindication, though it wasn't the kind she had imagined. As the day passed, Maria's phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications. She felt detached, as though the world outside the store was moving in slow motion. But there was a sense of satisfaction in it, a quiet, reluctant satisfaction. People were listening. They were finally seeing her. She could hear the buzz of the store, the customers coming in and out, the clatter of cash registers and the sound of the coffee machine. But today, it was different. Today, she was standing taller than she ever had before, and the weight of the world didn't feel quite so heavy on her shoulders. Yet, even as the waves of support flooded in, there was a gnawing emptiness inside her. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't happy for the defeat of Raymond. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. This wasn't about revenge, it never had been. The truth was what mattered. And for once, the truth was finally coming to light. Maria walked out of the back room, the phone still buzzing in her hand. As she passed the registers, she noticed the new faces behind the counters. The employees who hadn't been there when everything had started. Their eyes met hers briefly, and then quickly darted away. Some of them had already heard about the video. Some hadn't, but Maria could feel the shift. The change in the atmosphere. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her footsteps echoed softly as she moved through the aisles. She didn't need to look at her phone again to know the messages were still coming in. But the urgency had faded. What mattered now was not the validation she had longed for, but the quiet truth she had uncovered. The truth was out there, and Maria had never felt more at peace. But there was still one thing nagging at her. A question that lingered in her mind. A question that wouldn't let her rest. As the store continued to hum with activity around her, Maria's thoughts turned inward. She hadn't just done this for herself. She hadn't stood up for her dignity just to watch Raymond's downfall. No, this was bigger than that. She was doing this for every person who had ever felt powerless. For every employee who had been silenced by the weight of their own suffering. She thought about the others, her colleagues. The ones who had quietly borne the brunt of Raymond's cruelty without ever saying a word. Were they feeling the same sense of relief she was now? Or were they still trapped? Still bound by fear and the chains of their own doubt? Maria wasn't sure, but she knew what she had to do next. She had to be a voice for those who couldn't speak. She had to help them, just as she had helped herself. This wasn't just a battle for her, this was a movement. And it was just beginning. The door opened, and a young woman stepped inside. Someone Maria didn't recognize. She walked past Maria and paused briefly, glancing up at her with uncertain eyes. Then, to Maria's surprise, the woman smiled, just a small, tentative smile, and in that moment, Maria knew she wasn't alone anymore. As she turned to face the aisle ahead, Maria knew that no matter what came next, the truth was out, the battle had shifted, and now, all she had to do was keep walking. Maria sat in the dimly lit corner of the coffee shop, the cup of tea before her cold now, a reminder of how time seemed to slip away when thoughts took over. The past weeks had been a blur of small victories, each one edging her closer to a reality she hadn't dared to dream of. She had stood up for herself, for those who couldn't, and now the weight of it all felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. She had become the face of justice in her small corner of the world. But she knew, deep down, that her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Her battle had started with herself, gaining the courage to speak up, to reclaim her dignity from the clutches of apathy and fear. But the world had shown her something unexpected. There were others out there, like her, carrying burdens no one could see. And that realization, those faces, those stories, haunted her even as she smiled in triumph. The coffee shop was familiar. The hum of conversation around her a comforting sound. She hadn't been here in a while, not since everything had changed. But today, she needed the comfort of its routine. The barista smiled at her, a friendly recognition that still felt strange, like the world was shifting slowly, piece by piece. And then there was Sarah. Maria noticed the young woman standing by the counter, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. Maria recognized the hesitant expression, the silent battle raging inside her. It was the same look she had worn a few months ago, before she had found her voice. Sarah was new at the store, but Maria had already seen her there a few times. She had heard whispers among the staff, how Sarah had already started to feel the weight of the job, the long hours, the demands, the subtle yet sharp discrimination that seemed to hover in every corner of the store. Maria had once been just like her, quiet, invisible, waiting for someone to reach out. She didn't need anyone else to tell her what was happening. She knew. It was the same dynamic she had once accepted as normal, the power imbalance, the unfair treatment, the silence. She rose from her seat, her footsteps steady as she made her way to the counter where Sarah stood. The young woman's eyes widened slightly, the familiarity in Maria's gaze pulling her out of her thoughts. You okay? Maria asked gently, her voice quieter than she intended. But it was enough. Enough to signal understanding. Enough to show that someone saw her. Sarah hesitated, and for a moment, Maria thought she might walk away. But then, her shoulders slumped, and she nodded slightly, as if she had been waiting for someone to ask. Maria could see it in her eyes, fear, uncertainty, and a quiet desperation. It was the same look Maria had carried for so long. I'm not sure I can take it anymore, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the background noise. I don't know what to do. Maria placed a hand on the counter, leaning slightly closer, not because she was trying to pry, but because she understood. You don't have to do it alone, she said, her words simple but strong. It's hard, but there's power in speaking up. You don't have to be afraid. Sarah looked up, searching Maria's face, as if trying to gauge whether she was being sincere. Maria saw something in her expression, a flicker of hope. Something that hadn't been there before. I was scared, too, Maria continued, her voice low, her heart racing a little. But the first step, just speaking up, that's where the change begins. You can do it, Sarah. You don't have to let them keep you quiet. Maria didn't know where the words were coming from, but she spoke them anyway. Maybe it was because, in that moment, she knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about creating a space for others. A space where no one had to suffer in silence. Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Maria could see it now. The young woman wasn't alone anymore. She had found someone who understood. Someone who would help her find her voice. Just as Maria had done for herself. And as Sarah walked away, her steps a little more purposeful than before, Maria felt a lightness in her chest. The weight that had once been hers to carry alone was beginning to spread. To be shared, to be understood, and in that moment, Maria realized that the changes she had set in motion weren't just for her. They were for everyone who had ever felt small, silenced, unseen. The door of the coffee shop jingled as another customer entered. But Maria didn't move. She stayed right where she was, looking out the window at the world outside. She knew it wasn't over. That the battle for justice was far from won. But she also knew that the fight wasn't just about one person. It was about the quiet revolution of every person who decided they were tired of staying silent. She reached for her phone, reading the message that had come in just moments ago. Another one of her former colleagues, someone she hadn't heard from in months, had left a comment on her post. It wasn't just a like or a share, it was a message of solidarity. A declaration that they, too, would no longer stand by. The change was happening, little by little, and though it was still small, it was undeniable. As Maria sat back in her seat, her fingers curling around the cold teacup, she couldn't help but smile. There would be more battles, more people to help, more truths to uncover. But for now, she could rest, knowing that her journey had made a difference. Not every hero wears a cape, she whispered to herself, remembering the words she had read somewhere long ago. Some just choose kindness at the right moment. And in that quiet moment, Maria knew she had chosen well. Maria walked away from the store that day, not with a sense of victory, but with a quiet understanding. She didn't need to prove her worth to anyone anymore. The truth had come to light, not in the way she expected, but it had nonetheless shattered the silence that kept so many like her hidden in the shadows. The hardest battles aren't always the ones we choose to fight. They're the ones we're forced to face when no one is watching. When no one believes we matter. But sometimes, the smallest act of standing up can echo louder than any injustice ever could. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths. Let's keep listening to those who've never been heard.